Vidya Shankar, he completed his B Architecture from National Institute of Technology, Tiruchirappalli. He did his graduate training with architect Kukke Subramania, Bangalore, which was his initiation into the design practice. He then went on to pursue his Masters in Architecture from CEPT University, Ahmedabad, specializing on architecture, theory and design. During the years 2007-2010, he was working as an associate architect with the architect P.G. Sivakumar, Tiruchirappalli from Tamil Nadu, where gained design experience on varieties of projects ranging from college campuses to small residences. He then scaled heights by working with the architect Dean de Cruz, Goa, during the years 2013 to 2014. He received the opportunity to work on projects of intense design explorations with the master architect on varieties of projects including an art gallery, boutique hotel, housing and residential projects, all in Goa. Today, Vidya Shankar stands to be an esteemed visiting lecturer at few reputed architectural schools in Trichy, where he continues his academic interests through teaching.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series. We will be seeing the subject Theory of Architecture 1. We will be seeing the unit number 5 now, and that we will be discussing the topic called movement in detail. The contents of the discussions are an introduction to what is called a movement, and we will be seeing the various aspects of movement like approach, entrance, configuration of path-space relationship, form of the circulation space. Introduction. The aspect of movement in architecture. Movement is one of the most important aspects that influence an architectural experience. All the other aspects of architecture like form, light, color, etc. gets a dynamic meaning when perceived in a movement. Beauty of architecture cannot be simply perceived like how a sculpture is perceived at a distance. Rather, it involves a movement around and within it, which adds another layer of beauty and complexity to the art. We have many examples to depict the same discussion. In this chapter, we will discuss the following principles involved in movement, otherwise also called as the circulation in a building. The aspects are approach, entrance, configuration of path-space relationship and form of the circulation space. First, we will start with the aspect of approach. How a building or a space can be approached is a very interesting aspect, and there are many interesting ways of seeing it. Architecture is experiential. Prior to the actual passing into the interior of a building, we approach it along a path. This aspect of approach is the first phase of the architectural experience. This aspect can be manipulated to synchronize with the movement inside the building, or it may be purposefully contrasted to create a desired experience. We have many architecture examples from both the history and also the modern architecture where the aspect of approach has been utilized in a varieties of ways. There are certain categories of the approach in a building: the frontal approach, oblique approach and the spiral approach. We will see what does a frontal approach means. A frontal approach leads directly to the entrance of a building along a straight axial path. In this case, the visual goal is very clear. There is no confusion towards the destination. The picture depicts the same discussion. Other type of approach which is more interesting is the oblique approach, which leads to the entrance of a building at an angle which is not straight and perpendicular to the entrance. This approach enhances the effect of perspective and three-dimensional form of a building. The path can be redirected one or more times to delay and prolong the sequence of approach. So that's what this picture is showing here. When you approach a building, you can come, pause and turn again, so that the movement will be very interesting towards before approaching the main building. The approach can be spiral also, which leads through a path around the building in a spiral way. The path prolongs the experience and emphasizes the three-dimensionality of the building. Now we will see actual building examples of these varieties of approach. The very famous example where you have a straight frontal approach to the main building. You have many other examples in India itself. In this case, this is Humayun's tomb in Delhi. Most of the religious architecture in India have a straight axial path leading from the entrance to the main structure, which will be a straight frontal approach. From the past, we have the temples of Egypt. In this case, temple of Amen-Ra, where you have a straight frontal approach from the entrance till the main space of the deity. Now we will see some more examples of oblique approach. The glass house designed by architect Philip Johnson. It's a simple cube. The three-dimensionality of the cube can be only perceived by an oblique approach pathway, which is not straight and perpendicular to the building. In this case of Ronchamp Chapel by Le Corbusier, here also we have an approach which is not straight and simple. We have an undulating path that leads towards the chapel. We have an undulating path that leads towards the chapel. Not all the historical buildings will have a straight frontal approach. We have certain cases in European cathedrals where the cathedral will be located in the heart of the city, where you don't have a chance of a long straight frontal approach, but rather the approach will be oblique or spiral, which in a way is more interesting. Here you see certain plans of cathedrals in the heart of the city, of various cities in Europe. This is how you approach the very famous Florence Cathedral in Italy, where you don't have a path that leading towards the center elevation of the building, rather it shows only the side view of the building. Then the actual view of the building comes to you as a surprise like this. What is called as a path, the approach towards the building, can be more interesting, like what you see in this example of Santorini settlement in Greece. The traditional Palladian villas have are one of the best examples of straight frontal approach to architecture. We have some more examples here of the frontal approach, the Baha'i temple in Delhi, the Milona Association in Ahmedabad, where you have a straight frontal approach through a ramp leading to the main space. Now we will see in detail about the aspect what is called as entrance. In history of architecture and also in history of world, this element called as entrance to architecture has been explored quite a lot, and there are many interesting outcomes. Now we will see certain aspects about entrance, like how an entrance can be defined, what all the various categories of entrances, and what all various ways of opening an entrance in a wall. Entering a building or a room within a building involves the act of penetrating a virtual vertical plane that distinguishes one space from another. So entrance means entering from one zone to another zone, from outside to inside, or from one space to another space. That's what is meant here. How to define the entrance? The act of entering can be signified in a more subtle ways than puncturing a hole in the wall. It may be a passage through an implied plane established by two pillars like what is shown here, or an overhead beam like what is shown here. Even a simple change in level can establish a threshold and mark an act of entering like what is shown here. Here we have an example of entrance from Venice. The entrance signifying a transition from the waters to the land, from the sea to the Piazza San Marco. Entrance may be grouped formally into three categories: flushed entrance, projected entrance, and recessed entrance. A flush entrance maintains the continuity of the surface of the wall. A projected entrance forms a transitional space, accentuates the function, and provides a shelter like what is shown here. A recessed entrance also provides a shelter and receives a portion of exterior space into the inside of the building like what is shown here. We will see later certain examples of all these three categories. What a shape an entrance can be. In the normal situation, an entrance is accommodated by a opening in the plane of a wall. The form of the opening can range from a simple hole in the wall to an elaborate articulated gateway. It can be a simple split in the wall, or it can be a very elaborated decorated archway like this. Now we see about significance of location of an entrance. In terms of location, an entrance can be centered within the frontal plane of a building or be off-centered. The location of an entrance determines the configuration of the path and the pattern of activities within the space, like what is shown here. Now we will see certain examples of entrances to architectural spaces and buildings. Most of the cathedrals in Europe have a very elaborate decorated entrance way like this. This is an example of entrance which is not a projected form but is a scooped out form from the central mass from Indian Islamic architecture. Other example of entrance by subtracting mass from the main building, the British Council Library in Delhi by Charles Correa. Another example of entrance as a subtractive form. Entrance, what shape it can be? It can be a simple split like what you see in this John F. Kennedy Memorial. Again a simple split, but in a large scale, what is called as the pylons in Egyptian architecture, a split in the wall that causes an entrance to the main temple. Now we will see the aspect what is called as the configuration of the path. Configuration of the path here means the pattern and the form of the path, in what way paths can be arranged. That is what we are going to discuss in this section. The nature of configuration of a path both influences and is influenced by the organizational pattern of space it links. The intersection of path is a crucial point of pause, like what is shown here. The character and hierarchy of the path is determined by the continuity and the scale of and other aspects. The picture shows here network of paths where the paths join, but each and every path is of different widths. This difference in the width actually will give a different character to the path, whether it is a private path or a public path. When paths join, it creates a bigger space which acts as a gathering, pausing space. A simple path can lead to a very interesting activity and movement inside a building or in a scale of the city. Now we will see certain varieties of configuration of path. First, the linear path. If we have a series of spaces to be connected by a path, the linear form of path is the basic primary organizing element. It can have variations by being curvilinear or segmented, or by branching out into other parts, or by being looped. Straight path, you have a curvilinear path. Here it is shown as a path which is radiating from one point, path which is looped, path which is branching out, but all under the category of what is called as a linear path. Path can be radial and spiral also. A radial configuration has a linear path extending from or terminating at central and common point, like what is shown here. A spiral configuration is a single continuous path that originates from a central point, revolves around it and becomes increasingly distant from it, like what is shown here. A path can be in the form of grid also, or in the form of network. A grid configuration consists of two sets of parallel paths that intersects at regular intervals and creates squares and rectangular field of spaces. It does not have to be always perpendicular, it can be at an angle also. A network configuration consists of paths that connect established point in space. It may be composite in nature, employing some of the other preceding patterns of path. A naturally evolved path in cities and villages will be like this in a network way, which is a combination of the previous path. Now we will see certain examples of varieties of path that we discussed theoretically before. A sinuous undulating curvilinear path inside the building, a spiral path from the lower level to the higher level, Sanchi Stupa. In most of the traditional building you will have a straight path leading towards the center, and after entering the campus you will have a spiral movement around it. Here we have the case of Jaisalmer Fort, where you have paths of different scale and different varieties, which will help us understand the significance of the configuration of path. Here you have paths of various widths. The path here and here are very narrow compared to the path here and here. Actually that has a significance. These are all public paths and these are all the private residential streets, and where all these streets meet, a bigger space is formed which act as a pausing point, which is a plaza where the king meets the public. So based upon the form of the path, the activity also get influenced. This is a picture of the same street, the residential narrow path, and here's the picture of the plaza where all the path and street meets. Now we will see the aspect of path space relationship. A path basically connects many spaces. How it connects the spaces and how it passes through the spaces, we can have certain varieties and categories like this. First, the path can pass by the spaces without getting into the spaces. It can be separate by itself, to which various spaces are attached. In this case, the integrity of each space is maintained. That means it is not disturbed. The configuration of path is actually flexible. It can be straight, it can be spiral as seen before, without affecting the actual buildings or spaces that it is connecting. The second category is a path can pass through the spaces or through the buildings, like what is shown here. So both are interdependent. In cutting through a space, the path creates a pattern of rest and movement within it. The path affects the movement inside, the activity inside the space. A path can simply start from one point and can terminate at one point also, like what is shown here. Now we will see certain examples of all these categories. An example of simple path terminating at one end. A path which connects many spaces on either side. Most of the institution buildings will have many spaces which will be connected by a long corridor. In this case, this is the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, by Louis Kahn, where the path is very interesting with the alternative light and dark connecting all the spaces. A path can pass through many spaces without being a corridor. Most of the Indian temples will have series of spaces, like what is called as the mantapas and what you have with the main shikara, and the path pass through all these spaces unlike a corridor. Another example from contemporary world, the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur, where you have paths passing through the different parts of the building. Now finally, we will see about the aspect of form of the circulation space. Does a circulation space, or what is called as a path, does it has a form? Yeah, it has a form. It has a lot of aspects to be discussed. The form of a circulation space varies according to how its boundaries are defined, how its form relates to the form of the space it links, how its qualities of scale, proportion, light and view are articulated, how it handles charges in level with stairs and ramps. We will see certain pictorial examples of how path can be formed, different ways of defining the paths or the circulation space. The circulation space can be totally enclosed, like what is shown in the first figure, forming a public or a private corridor that relates to the space it links through an entrance. The circulation space can be open on one side, like what is shown here. So it connects to the exterior, can be open on one side, forming a gallery that provides visual and spatial continuity with the space it links. It can be open on both sides, like what is shown here. So it will have a more open feeling in contrast to the first one, which has a more enclosed feeling. The width and the height of the circulation space should be proportionate with the type and the amount of movement it must handle. A distinction in scale should be established between the public promenade, a more private hall and a service corridor. Based upon the activity and how many persons are going to be there, the form of the pathway, the circulation space has to be decided. Here it is a more private movement, so it is the scale is very small. At the end here, it is a more public sort of an activity and movement, so it has to be more wider and larger in scale. A narrow enclosed path naturally encourages forwards movement. To accommodate more traffic as well as to create space for pausing, resting or viewing, section of path can be widened, like what is shown here, instead of being a simple straight path. So the moment you have wider space in the path, it will create an interesting activity. A pause here. We will see certain examples of all these discussions. A path which connects the residential houses, which is simple, narrow in a residential scale, which also connect with the exterior, which is not totally enclosed. A path which is in a grander scale with a large height, which is have a public scale, which is not a private path. It connects to the exterior on either side, which is not totally enclosed. We have many examples of interesting paths all over the world. In this case, the colonnades of Bologna, where you have a covered pathway opening one side to the shops and commercial activities and opening other side to the road. Path can be manipulated in a very interesting manner by manipulating the light, the width of it and the height of it. This is an example from IIM Bangalore by architect B.V. Doshi. We will see this example of St. Peter's Square. Various aspects of path and circulation that we discussed in this chapter can be best exemplified with this example of St. Peter's Square in Rome. The main building in the square is this cathedral by Michelangelo, but the more interesting part of the building is the square in the front. This is the architecture just created for the movement. This is the gathering space. What you see around here is the colonnade for the movement towards the cathedral. Here mainly you have a simple frontal approach, but you have more to it. A public can walk straight through the square into the cathedral, or they can take a shaded pathway through this colonnade. This colonnade comes under the category of enclosure, which is not totally enclosed, but it would have just the columns on either side. This colonnade connects to the public space on either side. The scale of the pathway here on either side is of a very grand scale, making it to a monumentality of the cathedral. This example is in total contrast with what is going to see next. In this case, you don't have a plaza as such. You have a series of concentric pathways. There is a frontal approach till one point, but after which it's all concentric pathways. In the previous example, you don't have an actual entrance gateway. Here in this, you have many entrance gateways on all the coordinates. The scale of the pathway in comparison to the previous example, it's all of a narrow and short scale. Here we have another example of how an approach or entrance to a building can be very interesting. What you see in the center is an element of entrance to the Louvre Museum in Paris. You enter the building not through a major monumental porch, but you go inside to the basement in the central plaza through this glass pyramid, and you go to the various parts of the museum. This is designed by architect I.M. Pai. This design won a competition award just for how we have manipulated the approach or entrance to the building. Now we will see a summary of the discussion that we did in this chapter now. We discussed various aspects of movement, also what is called as circulation. First we saw about the approach, how a building or how a space inside the building can be approached. We saw various kinds of approach in it. Then we saw how an entrance to a space or a building can be. Again we saw how an entrance can be defined. We saw many examples from history and also modern architecture. Then we saw about the configuration of a path, in what all pattern a path can be arranged, and each and every pattern have a different usage. After configuration we saw how a path can be related to the space that is it connecting. We saw three categories in path-space relationship. Then we saw about how a space of circulation, a path, can have a form, and how the form can be very meaningful. We saw it with history examples, and also we saw some contemporary examples of different forms of circulation space. So with all these principles of circulation, an architecture can be made more interesting. Not just the space inside the building, just the path around it or path towards it can be manipulated in a very interesting way with all the principles that we saw now. We can take examples from the history and contemporary world, and we can apply to make the space more interesting. Now we will see certain questions to recall the discussion that we did today. What are the various aspects of movement or circulation in architecture? What are the different ways of creating an entrance to a building or entrance to a space within a building? What are the various configuration of path, or in other ways, what are the various patterns of path? Does path has a form? How it relates to the surrounding space? The main reference book for this discussion is Architecture, Form, Space and Order by D.K. Ching. Thank you.